So podcasting for museums, what, why, and how. So what is it that we're going to cover today? So really, I mean, I don't want to kind of read through this because I think it's self-explanatory, but really the core today is to have some thinking about how you can start developing your idea and what that involves in terms of planning, developing content. And I think just some of the things that we've learned in this process. So it's going to be quite, as Zoe said already, we're not experts on this. It's just based on the experience that we have had and what we found most useful. We'll also be thinking about some of the equipment that you might use. And this will be something that we cover later on in the presentation after we have a break, as well as editing. So there'll be a bit of technical information, but also, I guess, more about the process that we went through and how to conceptually kind of think about the podcast and how you want to develop your idea. And then towards the end, we'll just mention some of the options for hosting. So this is once you've made the podcast, how do you actually get it out there and launch it? So those are the aims for the session. And as I said earlier, for those of you who joined later, there will be some interactive and practical elements to the session today so that you get thinking about how you might develop your idea, and we'll be doing some breakout groups. So so just so that that's how we will structure the session. And there will be some resources that we send you after the session as well. Okay. Right. I wanted to also flag up from the beginning this quite useful, some of you might already know about this book, which was published by Hannah Hethmon 2 years ago now. So Hannah Hethmon is a podcaster, has done podcasts that are about engaged cultural nonprofits and other museums in Iceland, but she's got other projects. And this was a book that I just wanted to flag up from the beginning, because whatever we don't cover, it's probably addressed within this book. It's quite comprehensive. These things move quite fast, how podcasting happens. But I would say, even though it's 2 years old, this book, it's still, holds its ground. It's still up to date. It will be really helpful. And as I say, the most important thing is that it is directed specifically at cultural nonprofits. So it's quite practical, and it just shows how you might create a podcast on a budget. So I just wanted to put that out there from the beginning. And I don't know if Zoe, you wanted to add something at this point.
Yeah, just to add that we're going to be giving you the kind of basic principles as we see it of developing a podcast today, but we can't really give you the absolute chapter and verse on how to do it, in the same way that if you said, how should a museum do an exhibition, the answer would be very different depending on if you're the V&A or the local museum of wherever. It's a matter of scale and resources. And so in the same way that we couldn't say, here is a step-by-step absolute guide to how to do an exhibition, we're not giving you exactly that for how to do a podcast, but we're giving you the things to think about. And it will slightly be dependent on your budget and your resources and all of those things that we'll talk about as we go along.
Yeah, thanks, Zoe, for that disclaimer. So I guess just to start, before we start talking to you about experience, we've already heard a bit about where you come from, but it would be good, and you can put this in the chat, or if you feel like you want to raise your hand and speak, it would just be good to have a sense of, do you listen to podcasts, and how can you see the role of podcasting for heritage organizations, museums, galleries, wherever you work? So any sort of, don't want to take too much time with this, but just to have some initial ideas before I move on. Anyone wants to? Right, thanks. I actually couldn't see who was that was speaking, but thanks for...
That was Alice from the...
Oh, Alice. Oh, okay. Thanks, Zoe, for that. Yeah, I mean, I think I have to say, I haven't actually listened to that podcast, but it makes me want to listen to, actually, the way that a comedian and an art historian are sort of brought together, and the way that, I suppose, in the format, clearly they're thinking about what the intended audience is, which is something that has already come up, something intended for children. So how you might incorporate different elements in the podcast that have a certain dynamism or a more kind of interactive quality to them. So yeah, thanks for that. I see there's others coming up in the chat. Does anyone else want to say why they've chosen other podcasts, or what interests them about them, and sort of anything that's made them want to do one for their own museum? Yeah, thanks, Gabby. I think there's Yeah, lots of points there to think about. I think I really like the way that you were describing there's these other sounds that actually kind of like bleeding the everyday into the podcast. So actually, when you think about how the museum might appear like quite a formal space, when you enter that, actually the podcast might enable you to bring the audiences or the publics in a way that kind of dissolves a bit that boundary between daily life and the museum. And I think there's a lot of potential in that respect. And what was the other thing you were saying about the global dimension of it? That's something we've experienced, especially during lockdown, is that because then we weren't actually filming on site, we could have a range of people that might be someone was in Australia, for example. So actually having these more global perspectives can, I think, be one of the things that you can, in fact, I mean, I don't want to speak of the pandemic and lockdown as an advantage, of course, but I mean that they are, the current circumstances do mean that you might start to think about the way you produce this in a different way, and you might want to bring to speak. Okay, well, there's other comments going on. I think it's great that you're all bringing lots of thoughts. I'll probably move on unless anyone else wants to say something, or Zoe, if you want to add anything.
I
At
suppose
this
we
point,
just to say that we were just wanting you to get across the idea that there are lots of different formats for podcasts. It could be a rather formal interview. It could be a less formal thing, and it's good to listen to other people's podcasts just to get a sense of how other people do it, and that there are no rules really. Or you could listen to a range and see which ones you like. That was our main point there, I think.
yes, and I also like Harriet's point that's just made in the chat about how it's a great way to give platform for different voices, not necessarily museum voices. So I think, yeah, absolutely. We'll be saying more about that as we go along, but I'm just going to sort of move on. Do keep writing in the chat. If I don't respond straight away, it's because I don't actually see the messages, but we can pick those up later. Okay, so let's see. Sorry, sometimes the slides. Okay, there we go. So why make a podcast? I guess it's just important to start with this question, and some of the ideas have already popped up, but I just have a summary here of some of the things that I think are important to think about. And the first one concerns communication. We've sort of hinted at the fact that podcasting, like radio, is a really intimate medium. As I say there, it's as if you can almost speak directly into the audience's ears. So it can be a good way of, also people tend to listen to podcasts while they're doing different things. They might be washing up, commuting, not so much right now, but it's a way of actually incorporating potentially the museum and what you've got to offer into people's daily routines. If we think about accessibility, I think this is also really key, because podcasts, you can listen to them on your laptop, on your phone, on a tablet. They're accessible across a number of different platforms, and people can reach them in different ways from different sources. Also, they can access them at different points depending on what their schedules are. So I think thinking about accessibility in that regard, but also if you then have the podcast, how are you going to make it additionally accessible, say by having transcripts? It's one of the kind of important things to think about. We've mentioned audiences and growing your audiences or developing your audiences, and some of you already said that you were thinking of reaching new publics. I think this is worth bearing in mind, especially when we think about how the largest growing the largest growing podcast audience or listeners is young adults, which can often be some of the groups that depending on the museum can be harder to reach, so those aged between 15 and 24. So I think that there's a lot of potential for who you can be speaking to, and of course that's going to determine how you design the podcast, what format it has, what subjects you're going to deal with. Zoe referred to looking at other podcasts out there that other nonprofit organizations have done, and I'm leaving a link there that's from Better Lemon audio, which is produced by Hannah Hedmon, actually, but it's just really useful because it's a directory of all the podcasts, not just in the UK, but also worldwide, that different museums have done. So it can be a useful guide for you to refer to and just maybe listen to podcasts. If you're interested in crime podcasts, is there any other crime podcast that's being done by another museum and things like that. But just to get to maybe the kernel of this, as I say at the bottom of that slide, is what have you got to say that is unique? I think this is something really worth thinking about. Is why is the podcast the way to go as opposed to other other things that you could do, be it digital or be different forms of public engagement. So what is it that you've got to say that hasn't already been said, or that any other institution has said? And this comes down to fine-tuning what the unique identity of the organization is, and in terms of its scope, in terms of the remit, in terms of its audiences. So I think there's never enough time that can be spent on this question before you actually go ahead and commit to a podcast. And I'll be saying a little bit more about that in terms of the planning, but just wanted to sort of flag that up from the very beginning, because a good podcast does require pre-planning and reflection. And ideally, this is also done collectively within your teams. Okay, so this leads me to thinking about, I guess, breaking this up a little bit. Already mentioned why would you make a podcast, but I wanted to just deal with each of these key questions, which I think are important to think about when you're developing your idea, which is the why are you going to make a podcast? What is a podcast going to be about? For whom? So who are you going to be doing this for? And then how are you going to actually develop that? So I'm going to go bit by bit with each of these questions. I don't intend to suggest that these should happen in a linear fashion. I think these are things that you need to think about all at the same time, but just for the sake of clarity, I will follow that sequential structure. And I'm of course going to draw on our experiences in developing That Feels Like Home, which is the podcast that we did at Moda. So that's where I'm coming from. So as I said, why are you going to make a podcast? It's really essential to take time and consider why you're going to do this. For Moda, there had already been a fair amount of work being done with a website. So I should say that Moda doesn't actually have physical gallery spaces. So there's no exhibitions happening. So the website is quite a key platform for engaging audiences. And so in a way, the podcast was part of a larger project to revamp the website, in which we wanted to emphasize the co-creative collaborations that happen within the university and with other researchers that use the collections. And so the podcast had to reflect that in some way, whilst also not losing sight of the collections themselves. So in a way, this was about how do we further develop Moda as a digital museum. And the photograph that you're seeing on the right-hand side is a photograph from some student project that was using the collections and then using that as inspiration to develop new work. So in a way, that was to be reflected in the podcast as well. The collections, when we teach, when we work with students, with researchers, they are often a prompt for thinking about more contemporary issues, for challenging, bringing challenging questions to the collections. And this, was what we thought would be good to carry on doing the podcast, or to bring that, I suppose, all of that into the podcast, so that these conversations that we keep having with students and with academics, they would be visible, because often a lot of goes on, there's a lot of projects, but these things go unrecorded. So this was an attempt to, I guess, embed the work that the museum does more within the larger organization, which is Middlesex University, but also then making links with research and practice that happens outside of the university. Another thing also that we consider in terms of a podcast, as opposed to other kinds of digital outputs, say videos, for example, is that videos would have been much more resource intensive in terms of what you need, the equipment that you need, the amount of staff and the expertise that you need to produce a video. So I think there are also practical considerations to bear in mind when you're thinking if the podcast is the right thing, as opposed to, as I say, to other kinds of outputs that you might have. So staffing, resources, and time and availability should also figure at the front, I think, of your thinking when you're going ahead in embarking on such a project. Okay, so I'm going to move on to what. So what is the podcast going to be about? So the what should also be at the heart of the development of the podcast idea, because this is finding out what is unique about what you do and what can you contribute that no one else is doing, or is other people are doing similar things. How are you going to do it in a different way? For Moda, as I was saying earlier, there are the collections, which are the core of the museum. And these are mostly collections that focus on the histories of home and domestic space, broadly from the mid, sort of 1870s, 1880s through to the 1960s. But as well as those collections, there is, as I said earlier, that whole Middlesex University research culture, artistic practice, together with the outputs that come from that, which is how we engage with students and academics to develop new perspectives. And we've termed that co-creation. So in a way, the podcast had to, I suppose, encompass all of those different aspects. For this, in order to explain a bit the process, in order to do this, I was engaged in a period of research that involved thinking about the podcast as a whole, but also looking into other podcasts, thinking about the speakers that we might invite, and the collections that we wanted to be foregrounded. So are these going to be collections that are relatively obscure, or are these going to be collections that are already highlights of the museum? Having those considerations is also important when you're embarking on this project. The period of research took several months in my case. And so I was also exploring partnerships and projects that the museum had done previously, and thinking about how we could cast new insights in the collections. So in terms of how, the sequence of events happened, is that I would then present my thinking at any staff meeting that we had, and got feedback from colleagues. And I know this is kind of sounds really kind of maybe obvious, but I think I can't stress enough the importance of getting feedback from your team that you're working with, because that really helps, and having brainstorming sessions to develop together what the podcast might be about. So I think always getting, whether it's from listening to the podcast or talking to other people, getting that sort of feedback or other ideas that can bring other perspectives, I found personally really useful. And here, there's one thing I wanted to mention in terms of when you're developing the what. One thing that might be quite helpful is to think of a pitch. So the page that you're seeing here on the left-hand side is a screenshot from a document from Hannah Hethsmon's Your Museum Needs a Podcast. So if you get the book, you get a CD, and with that you get different files, including a template pitch. We actually worked with this template pitch to work out what it was that we wanted to say, and that pitch will include the podcast concept, but also what are the strategic goals, what are the costs, the time and work required, and then other questions like hosting, marketing, the start date. So I think that pitch as a document that helps you really be very concrete and specific about what it is that you want to achieve can be quite useful once you've had a time of processing and thinking and reflecting and researching, to put it down so that it then makes a coherent proposal. Because as I said earlier, I think having a clear, unique identity to the podcast that is cohesive is something that will attract listeners, because they know what to expect. There's so I hate to even, I don't quite like talking in these sort of sales or more corporate terms, but I think maybe if you can think about this as something that you are trying to sell this, maybe, or you're not trying to sell the idea in any case to the museum where you work, or to but also to your listeners, right? So I think thinking about this is quite useful. And
if I could just chip in there.
Yeah.
Just say, the idea of developing a pitch. If you work in a large museum, you might need to persuade your senior management or senior colleagues that going ahead with a podcast is a good idea. So having a really well thought through pitch is probably essential in that case. But even if you're in a small museum and you're more able to make autonomous decisions, it's still a good idea to develop a pitch and show it to someone else, just as a kind of way of thinking, like, are these ideas persuasive? Does this idea work? Is it, is it going to make sense to someone? And it's not just, just to have a bit of a sanity check on it, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I was thinking whether it took a great deal of persuasion to get Zoe to agree, but I think it was fine. Anyway, gonna move on to the next. Very persuasive. I was very persuasive with my pitch. Okay, so with that we come to, this is you might be familiar with this website. This is from the museum's webpage, and it's where the podcast sits. It's called That Feels Like Home. And so through this thinking, we got to what finally emerged was a coherent set of concerns about the collections that where we wanted to explore issues around the home, domestic culture, everyday life, housing, homemaking. And as I said earlier, this was about taking the collections as a starting point to reflect on wider sets of issues that might connect to more contemporary discussions, and also to the research that's being done at Middlesex and beyond. And here we also wanted to incorporate a richness of perspectives. I think Alice was mentioning earlier a comedian and an art historian being brought together, or maybe it was Gabby. So similarly, we brought together often, say, an anthropologist and a sociologist, an artist, and a nurse. So I think, and actually in some of the feedback that we got about the podcast, that interdisciplinarity, which, speaks to the culture of the university as a whole, was one of the things that people really seemed to value. So that was what we came to. And also as we developed this idea, we increasingly realized that we wanted to have a podcast that was expansive in how it thought about the home. So part of the role of the podcast, and this happened in the process of making it, was to challenge traditional views of home as an ideal space, as also often having certain associations with class and gender and race. So we wanted to problematize that, and that's an ongoing thing. We're still thinking about what the next season will be. But what I'm trying to say here is that I've sort of said to you, well, you need to have a very clear identity of the podcast. And I think that's important, but I think it's also worth bearing in mind that that might evolve as you're in that process, and that what might end up happening, as it's been the case for us, is that different seasons might then zoom in to a particular set of questions. So I think you can think of the overarching podcast, but then there's, as it were, the seasons you might do, and then the individual episodes. So you want some coherence between those three levels, but I think you also want a diversity of as I was saying, of perspectives, of different questions that you're asking through the podcast.
So just there as well, what Anna is really sort of describing there is the process of working out what the podcast will be about, and ensuring that it's consistent with a museum's brand. So we, as at Moda, we'd already had a long interest in histories of the home, in questions of domesticity. So to focus on these same themes, but in a slightly different way, made complete sense for us. But you would need to work out what is going to make sense to be consistent with your museum's brand, well, either to be consistent with it or to divert from it in a slightly new and innovative way, but consciously, so that it all kind of still makes a coherent sense.
Yes, and I think for us, part of what this thinking is involved is also thinking who is going to be in the podcast, and I think what Harry mentioned earlier about having non-museum people, I think it's also worth thinking, well, how the podcast is an opportunity to not have the usual suspects, as it were, in the program. So maybe you want to actually think more broadly and more creatively in terms of who can be in the podcast. And I think thinking about the interviewees from early on in the design of the podcast, or the development of the podcast, is a useful thing to do, and will also help you define the topics that you want to explore. Okay, so for whom? This is, of course, a really important question. I mean, it's something that we would be thinking about if we were going to plan an exhibition or a public engagement program. So podcasts is no different. And with our case, we initially were thinking of our Twitter followers. You can see there on the right-hand side, just the screenshot. So at the point where I started working at the museum, I think it was about 12K, and now it's just over 17K. So it has grown a lot in that period. Now, the followers that follow the Museum of Domestic Design and Architecture tend to be people that are interested in design history, histories of the home, art history, etc. So that was, I guess, the first sort of bulk of audiences that we knew we would reach, because we would also use the social media to promote the podcast. But at the same time, and I'm moving to the image on the left-hand side, we were very mindful, as I've said already, about all the student community at Middlesex and other students that we work with beyond Middlesex. So gradually, as we've been developing the podcast, we've been thinking also about what themes and subjects are relevant to the different course modules that we're often engaging with as I teach. So I co-teach with a lot of lecturers at Middlesex. And this has meant that we've then sought to build closer relationships with Middlesex lecturers, embedding the podcast now as part of learning resources at the university, but also doing a session of methods of podcasting with, for instance, students of public health. Recently, I went and talked to them about the experience of running a podcast. So in a way, we started thinking, with the existing audiences, and gradually we've been thinking about, well, how can we be more connected to the direct audiences that we work with, which are largely the Middlesex student and research community. So that's just kind of our experience. But I think the podcast can be a very good way of getting, of connecting with other audiences that you might not have been connecting with thus far. So yeah, so I think that's, Zoe, did you want to add anything at this point?
No, I just thought it was interesting earlier when I think it was Alice said about the Household Cavill Museum. So that's an example of where you've probably been concentrating on your external public audience, but this might be an opportunity to focus on a slightly different audience, as you said. So that, I thought that was a very interesting point that you made there.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so going to the final question, how are you going to make the podcast? And here, I mean, there's countless options, and we can't cover everything in the session today. So I just want to go through some basics, really, that I've tried to extract in those little squares. But of course, if there are questions, then we can pick those up later on. So I just want to say a few things about the format, because I think deciding on the format that you're going to choose for a podcast is quite important. So is this going to be a simple conversation that's relatively informal? Will it just be between two people, or will you have a three-way conversation? And thinking about how those choices actually do affect the sort of the tone and the pace of a podcast. So in the podcast we've done, we've generally gone for a three-way conversation. Sometimes it's more of an interview format where it's just one other person and myself as the main host. And as I said, we've tried to build those conversations so that they reflect different perspectives. So I mentioned earlier a nurse and an artist, a historian and a geographer. So thinking about that will help you, I guess, better understand what the tone of the podcast is that you want to achieve. Do you want to keep it quite loose? Do you want to have it quite tightly scripted? And how long is the podcast going to be? I mean, there's our podcast started being about half an hour, and we've actually gone up to close to 45 to 50 minutes. But of course, thinking about a 50-minute podcast or doing a 50-minute podcast puts a different set of demands on your listeners in terms of the time that they have. So those considerations are important to have, because you might actually want to do really short podcasts. It could be that you want to just zoom into one particular question, and that podcast could last for 10 to 15 minutes. Those podcasts also exist. So I think all these questions are as well as like the frequency that you will publish, will it be relatively frequently, will it be every month, is, you know, is part of just thinking generally about how this podcast is going to, you know, how is it going to, what's the format going to be? And yeah. And that obviously links to research and planning. So when you are, there's a lot of preparation that goes on into developing each episode before you you actually go about and record it. And I think there's quite a few questions to ask yourselves here when you're embarking on this initial research stage. So why is a topic that you've chosen worth talking about? Why does it matter? I mean, actually, I think asking you quite frankly, who is going to care about this? You need to be the first person that's persuaded that this subject is of interest. Who are going to be the main characters, and who will people or listeners care about or feel strongly about? How will listeners also relate to the story? How will they connect to what is being told? I think here, thinking about how you engage listeners, um, thinking, is the podcast going to be entertaining, or how are they going to keep engaged at least? And as I've said already, who are you going to invite, and why would they be the best person to speak? And so as you, I guess, do that research planning, then you're also thinking about how you're building a story, which is moving to the third point here. So how you're going to script the podcast to give it a certain structure. I think here, I mean, there's some podcasts that you can not script at all, and it can be incredibly candid and informal. We have actually gone, I guess, for a sort of in between, so that there would be a script, but then we wouldn't necessarily always stick to the script. The importance for us, I think, in having a script was in guiding listeners through the discussion, sometimes about topics that can be, you know, fairly academic, or that they might not be familiar with. So I think they're reminding listeners what is it that they're listening to, and signposting what the key ideas are is useful, and thinking also about maybe having a sort of beginning, a middle, and an end. So that's why I use the word story, because I think you could almost think of the podcast as having a narrative arc of sorts. You might have, you know, sort of points of more climax or of greater interest, and then there will be other points that are perhaps a little bit transitions from one topic to another. But I think those points of interest are key to keep the audiences or the listeners engaged, because listeners will want to know what the significance is of what you're communicating, and why it's relevant. So keeping consistency and how what you're saying also links to the broader themes of the show. So always thinking between the relationship between the individual episode and the broader podcast is important here. In terms of scripting, I think, I mean, this might be quite self-evident, but I think one can't stress enough the importance of direct language. So avoiding passive voice, writing in the present, and before you actually go and record the interview, record the conversation, maybe read aloud before recording, so that you sort of, you know, you've rehearsed that, and you're familiar with what you're going to say. And I've personally found that really useful, often even having a chat before allowing time for a chat with the speakers that we were going to interview before we started recording, so that we were already in the flow of things. And I had a sense of so we had I guess not a mock recording, but we had a sense of what was going to be addressed and what was going to be covered. And I think that can then make things a bit looser and actually help in having a more informal presence in the podcast. Keeping audiences engaged, my fourth point, I feel like I've already mentioned this quite a bit, but I think here you might want to use not just about what you're saying, but also what sound are you going to bring into the podcast? Are you going to have are you going to introduce it with some music, or some, perhaps a quote that you've pulled out that's, you know, especially catchy or impactful? So I think often I think it's commonly said from a podcast that the first 2 minutes are quite significant in terms of keeping your listener sort of alert and engaged. So how are you going to sort of introduce them into the conversation? And then how are you going to keep the momentum of the conversation going? And I mentioned some things about how to do that in building a story. I think here it's also worth saying that when editing was mentioned in our initial discussion, and I know Zoe will say more about that later, but when you're editing and reviewing the conversation afterwards, I think keeping the only the best and most relevant parts of the interviews is what I would personally recommend. I sometimes found it hard, and then it was really helpful to have Zoe as a reader of the interview to chop up some things that I was finding it hard to let go of. But I think you don't want your listeners to get lost with unnecessary detail. So I would really discourage episodes that are unnecessarily long. Anything that's in the podcast should be there because it absolutely needs to be there. It's essential to the story that you're telling. So I don't think being shy to edit things out or to be almost even a bit ruthless is actually can be a positive thing. I think. Be visual. So I've added that because this is one of the most commonly said things about podcasts is how it's one of the most visual media. You've probably heard this said before, and I know it's a bit of a cliche, but I do think it actually it holds true to, especially if you're thinking of arts podcast, bearing in mind that your listeners don't have the image to support what you're saying, is that you need to help them create those mental images. So you might want to have descriptive passages. You might want to just also brief your guests that being visual is an important part of what the podcast involves. And because of course people can't see what you're talking about, so conveying that in words is essential. And I've put link to the now. This, I guess, refers especially to what we've done at Moda, because we have historical collections, but then we have contemporary practice. So I think there's always been that link to the contemporary, or trying to address things that concern people at the moment. I don't think that necessarily applies to all podcasts, so I don't want to say you should all be linking to contemporary issues, but I think it's something that we found quite useful when we were thinking about the podcast and how to make it relevant. So I guess it's maybe not linking to the contemporary necessarily, but thinking about how is this relevant now?
Yeah, just to add there, Anna, just to jump in at that point, that we were clear that each of our episodes had to have some relationship to the museum's collections, but we were also clear that we're using those collections as a starting point for discussion. And in our case, we were interested in issues that are relevant in the present and ideas of the home and so on. So in other words, we weren't doing a kind of antiques roadshow discussion around historic objects. But that's not to say that you couldn't do that. But again, it's about thinking about how you connect your museum and your collections to the sorts of interests that your audiences might have. So how can you make your podcast relevant, and why will people want to listen to it? More than just your mum, who might want to listen out of politeness or loyalty. You're going to have to make it of interest to a wider audience than that.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just leaving here a podcast checklist, which has some of the basic questions that you will need to ask yourselves. And obviously you're going to have the presentation later on. So, no need to jot down anything here, but just so that this is something that maybe you can return to, and then hopefully it helps in developing the idea. Okay, so it's been quite a lot of Zoe and myself talking to you about what we think a podcast should, the development of a podcast should be and what experiences are. But we wanted to have now a bit of a more interactive component in which you think about the steps that you would take to develop this idea. So there were already some questions that we asked you to think about in advance of the session. So I've included them at the bottom. What is your proposed podcast about? What is its title? What makes the podcast unique? And how does it relate to your museum identity? So these are things that we've covered already in terms of our experience of Moda. So hopefully you've had the chance to also think about it before the session. So we're going to break you to do some breakout groups now. And we'd like you to share this idea that you've developed with a group, and then together consider how you're going to, what are the next steps based on also what we've said now and what we've been sharing with you. How are you going to develop this idea, and how are you going to reach your target audiences? So if also then you could be prepared to feedback to the group. So I hope that's clear. On the one hand, it's sort of sharing your idea with your group, but then together discuss and share how you might take the new steps to develop that idea and how you will reach your target audiences. So I'm going to stop sharing the presentation now.
Okay, so in this section, I'm going to be talking a bit about equipment. But I guess my main message here is also that there are no straightforward answers. So it very much depends on what your museum already has. You might already have equipment, on your levels of expertise and how much money you want to spend. So what you want to achieve will influence what equipment is appropriate and vice versa. So as we've already been talking a lot about, you'll have already been thinking about the sort of brand image of your podcast and how that relates to the brand image of your museum. And in a sense, it's possible to do things very cheaply, very kind of on the fly. And if that's consistent with what you're trying to achieve, that would be great. Just think about, though, how you frame your audience's expectations of what they're going to be hearing. So the recorders or the equipment that we happen to have is a recorder called a Zoom H6, which is easy to use. There's loads of tutorials online. It produces decent quality sound. We also have a Behringer microphone, which does decent recording quality, but it can produce what they call popping Ps, which is a kind of, an explosion of sound when someone's speaking. And it also picks up a bit of background noise. But there are other combinations of equipment, so we don't really have either the time or the expertise to exactly tell you what to buy. And as I say, it's maybe more a question of experiment, see what you've already got, and see how that fits with your own levels of expertise. During lockdown, we actually recorded remotely using Microsoft Teams. We also had a extra little hand recorder and a USB mini that we could plug into the laptop. So that's just to kind of emphasize that it is possible to do things in a slightly kind of Heath Robinson kind of way. And the sound quality of those turned out perfectly fine. If you're, think about what other resources that you might be able to draw on. So if you're a university museum, is there equipment or studio space that you can borrow? What other networks do you have where you could pull in favors from someone? And then also consider whether you want to record tracks separately or as one single track. Also, I said it's not impossible just to use iPhones and then cut those recordings together. Hang on. This was a slightly embarrassing picture of us recording during the pandemic, where Anna built herself a small tent involving lots of padding and kind of climbed into it under the table, just to reduce the background noise. So just to kind of go back to that one, in addition to the recording equipment itself, think about the location where you're intending to record. So is there a lot of background noise? That might be traffic or ticking clocks or the bin lorry arriving. So think about whether you can produce a sort of noise absorbent space like Anna is showing here. Can you use fabrics to dampen the noise? Or actually, is that going to be part of the selling point of your podcast, that you're recording in the atmosphere of your museum, and that might be within reason part of the, you know, the charm of it. But do think about unforeseen circumstances, like things, you know, the cleaner coming past outside, because that might spoil your recording. Not sure how, oh, here we are. So, oh, sorry, just to go back to the recording bit before we come on to editing. Before the day of recording, I would recommend making sure you're really familiar with your equipment. Check the spare batteries, check that you've got all the leads you need, do some test recordings, get as comfortable as you can with the process of recording so that you're not distracted by that on the day. Listen back to your test recordings and check that you're happy with the quality. So I would just emphasize practice, practice, practice before you've got your star guest on hand. And on the day, do a sound test and check that all your equipment works again before you embark on the actual recording. If you're recording remotely, you'll also have to worry about the internet connection and ensure that is stable. And often if you turn off the camera, that helps to remove the load on the bandwidth. So coming on to editing, the first important question is who's going to edit it? As we've already said, it's quite important to edit, we think, because there'll be lots of you know, bits of random chat in between things, or times when people mumble or mutter that you might want to cut out, or they might go off on a tangent and you want to cut a whole chunk out. So think about, do you have the time and the resources to edit yourself? And that might be time consuming, even if cost effective. So there are certain software that you can use, like Audacity, which would enable you to do the editing in-house. And I think Alec said you might do, you're either going to do some training on that, or are you going to point people to existing videos on YouTube?
Yeah, I'm gonna have a look at the existing videos and see how appropriate they are, and if they are, I'll pass them on, and if they aren't, I'll make one myself.
Great, yeah. So in other words, it's entirely possible to do the editing yourself, but just be aware that, again, dependent on your time and your existing expertise, that might be quite resource intensive. So for our I think we did that for the first series, but in the second series, we decided to outsource the editing and pay someone to do it, because we found that was, you know, cheaper in the long run and quicker and more cost effective. It's also worth saying that we think it's worth getting a transcription made of your whole recording, because then you can edit it, as it were, on paper. Then when you give it to the sound editor or to whoever is doing your editing, you can indicate on paper what you want them to cut out. And that's just, again, a kind of useful part of the process, but it does take a bit more, either your time, or again, you could pay someone to do that. And again, we paid in the second series, having had the experience of doing it ourselves, we decided to pay someone, and it cost about £100 or so per episode, depending on how long each of your episodes last. We've already said that each of our podcasts were about 40 minutes long. It's also worth mentioning music and copyright. If you're going to include music, you need to make sure it's copyright free, or that you have permission to use it. But there are lots of websites with access to free music which you can download without infringing copyright. I think we're going to add that to the resources list at the end. So just to say, in terms of all of this, you need to achieve a reasonable sound quality so that people keep listening. But beyond that, it's up to you how professional you want to make it sound. It doesn't have to be studio quality. It can be more of a vox pop style if that's what you're going for. I think as long as it doesn't kind of hurt people's ears as they're listening to it, and that is what people will make people turn off in the first 2 minutes if it's unbearable to listen to. But again, it's partly about setting audience expectations for what your podcast is trying to do. Has anyone got any questions about that? No?
Oh, can I ask, it's Sheila from the Soldiers Company. When you talk about setting expectations, how would you do that? Would you say at the beginning of the podcast, or how would you do that?
I suppose that's in everything that you in all of the ways that you talk about the podcast before someone listens to it. So someone might read a bit of blurb about your podcast somewhere. They might see a tweet about it, and if it says, if it gives the impression of a kind of Neil McGregor British Museum kind of thing, that's going to set one set of expectations. If it's such and such small museum takes you behind the scenes, that would give the impression of a slightly more potentially rough and ready. Do you see what I mean? It's about when you're explaining to people why they should listen, part of what you're doing there is setting the expectations of what they're going to get. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I just add one quick thing? In that sense, when we were doing season 2, which we were doing on Microsoft Teams, as Zoe said, and from my bedroom, I did have a caveat at the very beginning, in which I think it's in the trailer, but also at the beginning of each of the episodes, in which I mentioned the sound quality. So you could introduce, it's not even a caveat. You can just even say we're recording this. Say that you are recording in the museum, the stores, and it might be quite an echoey space. So I think there's ways in which you can just make that part of the narrative. As Zoe said, you can make it almost a selling point. And then people will just see it in that way, rather than think of it as a problem that the sound quality is not good enough. I think there was another question in the chat. Is there?
No, Alex,
okay, Alex, sorry, it's a comment.
Link, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. We're going on to the...
Yeah, okay, this is me. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, thanks, Zoe. So Zoe has spoken about making the podcast, editing it, and now I just wanted to cover quite quickly, because again, this is something that could take us quite a long time, talking about how to put your podcast online, but just explain some of the main differences between hosting sites and directories. So these, you can see there on the left-hand side, you might recognize some of the hosting sites like Blubrry, Libsyn are quite well known, and I'll just explain in a bit what those are, as opposed to the directories, which is where people actually get their podcasts from. So I'm just going to make that difference so that you know what does it take once you have your podcast to get it out there. So the hosting site, and you've seen those names already, this is where the podcast lives in the web. So you need to imagine it as a cloud of sorts. So you do the podcast and you upload it to whichever hosting site you've chosen. We are using Podbean. This is one of the most well-known ones. There's some that have been around for a while, like Blubrry. There's others that are relatively newer. And I think this, again, like Zoe said, it depends on, I think, doing a bit of research. And often there's websites that compare different hosting site providers, what might work best for you, because each hosting site will have a different plan. And that plan often depends on the amount of data that you want to upload on a monthly basis. So there's plans saying from £4 a month to, possibly something like £80 a month. I don't know exactly for sure, but it's quite a broad spectrum. And that will also enable you to obtain different stats. And I think statistics can be useful, especially when you're thinking of developing your audiences, because you can have a breakdown of where people are listening your podcast, of what sites they're getting them from. So the hosting site does all of that work for you. And depending on that plan, you might have more or less information about the listening kind of habits of your audience. The hosting site then creates this RSS feed, which is what directly is submitted to all the main directories where people source their podcasts. So if you listen to podcasts, and just moving on to the next slide about podcast directories, you might be listening to from Apple Podcasts, Spotify. There's a range of sources. So the hosting site feeds it directly to those, and that's where you get your audiences linking to your podcast. So that's where they would download. So I just wanted to make that difference clear, because it was something that I found a bit tricky at first to know. So what happens afterwards? We have the podcast, and where is it best to upload it? And I think we're saying that there is a research that needs to be put into that to find out what's the best plan that works for you and what's the best platform that works for you. Okay, so then you have you've worked all of this out, and I just want to say now a few words about reaching your audiences. There's a few things that maybe came up in the conversations already, because we'd asked you this question: how are you going to reach your audiences? This is the things that we've been thinking about and the things that we have done. So doing a trailer before you actually release your first episode, a trailer that sums up the essence of the podcast, that's catchy, that has maybe some music. And Zoe spoke about copyright, which is a really important thing to bear in mind, but also because there are websites where you can download music for free. So they're royalty-free websites, and we can provide some of those links in the resources to follow. We used non-copyright music that you could it's part of Creative Commons. So there is a lot out there that you can use, but of course you could decide to commission, or you could decide to pay for it. So that again depends on how many funds you have and your resources. Word of mouth does work. I would say when you have the podcast out there, tell everyone. Oh, sorry, don't know what happened there. Tell everyone that you know about the podcast, and have information about the podcast on your website. If there is a museum website, you might want to do a post about it. We have a newsletter that we send around whenever we release a new podcast, and it's a podcast specific newsletter. So we have the museum newsletter, which will feature the podcast as well whenever there's any news, but we also have a podcast newsletter. So I think there's a risk that if you just have one newsletter that then talks about the podcast and it's sort of left at the bottom, people might miss it. So it's one decision that we made was let's have something that's specific about the podcast. Of course, tweeting and social media, you could even create an informal launch team. We haven't done this, but again, we have 17K followers. So, often people do retweet the podcast, but you might want to have a group of people that will then, will retweet your podcast. So that's how you might start to build those followers further. And I think I mentioned earlier how regularly you publish your podcast. We started publishing, I think, every month. And then between season 1 and season 2, we realized that it was probably better to publish podcasts on a weekly or fortnightly basis, so that there would be some momentum to the publication of each of the podcasts. And this could be in a more compressed period of time. But that would ideally, or is what we hope, and we have seen this in the stats with numbers of listeners growing, keep them more engaged. Reviewing your stats and comparing the data across months. Usually one of the things that's commonly said is that if you have about 100 downloads the first month of releasing the podcast, that's quite good. But what's most important is that your audiences keep growing in terms of establishing, I guess, the success or the success of the podcast. So you can then look at that data to think about how you might promote the podcast in new ways. So this might involve doing tweeting with quotes, or using images, or there's a whole lot of things that you can do. But I think reviewing that on a regular basis is always good. So I think I've already said most of the things that I want to say here about podcast publicity and promotion. Just there's an example here on the right hand side with one of the podcast quotes that we pulled out with an image with from the podcast we did with the anthropologist Sarah Pink. So we tweeted this, and we've done this with several other episodes, extracting a key quote with an image that often is maybe a bit funny, or I don't know. This was chosen by our colleague Sean. So it's, you know, this Sarah Pink is talking about the differences in housework and the Indiana Jones kind of character, and yeah, pick that image. So anyway, so you can use humor, you can be quite, people have mentioning the jovial tone of podcasts being conversational. So I think taking that to the way you communicate the podcast and social media is also a good thing. Maybe connecting to other conversations that are ongoing. So are there museums that are, or other other ways in which certain key people or organizations are linking to the themes of the podcast, and can you tweet to them directly? So being quite strategic about how you think of social media with a podcast is a thing that I think you can't really do enough of. So, and then we have the British Podcast Awards. I think we did apply this year. Did we, Zoe? I don't think nothing came out of it, but maybe that's something that you want to do as well.
Just to say also there that, you know, make sure you tweet to anyone who participated in your
of course, yeah.
You know, so then they'll be, you know, tweet to thank them for participating in it, and then hopefully they'll retweet to their followers. And when we say tweet, we're also including Facebook, Instagram, whatever else as well.
Yeah. Okay, so I think, Zoe, we're going to do some sort of wrap up, and I think maybe just leave some time for questions.
Yeah. So just to say very briefly to finish off that we hope we've given you a good overview of the sorts of things that you would need to think about when planning a podcast for your museum. We haven't tried to give you an exact plan of what to do, because there are so many factors that are variable between institutions, including the resources that you have available, the expertise you have in-house, the willingness of your senior colleagues to let you do whatever. But we hope we've given you the confidence to be able to see that with a bit of imagination and a bit of planning, that this is both possible and fun, and has the potential to connect you with audiences far beyond your existing ones, and most importantly, perhaps far beyond your immediate geographical area. And of course, at the moment, that's, you know, in the context of lockdown, that's more important than ever. So if anyone's got any questions, do feel free to put your hands up or
There's a question from Harriet, in the chat. So Harriet is asking, how much time did we dedicate after the initial planning phase? How much time does it take to plan, record, edit each episode?
So well, again, it's slightly how long is a piece of string, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I think we can, though, drawing on our experience. I mean, usually I would plan each episode, and that would take me about a day and a half, I would say, of both researching and scripting it, bearing in mind that also I had to communicate with the interviewees. So I would say about a day and a half at the very least. Then you will often record. We didn't plan to record for more than an hour, even though sometimes we did go over slightly. The reason for that is because the more you record, the more there is to either to transcribe and to edit. So I think it helps to keep it quite compact if you can. I mean, that was how it worked for us. So we try to keep it within the hour, but I would always ask the guests to block off 3 hours in case there was any issues, or, you know, some things can come up. You might want to have a chat beforehand. So I would say at least 3 hours then on a morning or afternoon. And then after that, we would send it to the transcribers. So that's not something that we would do ourselves. If you were transcribing yourself, I would imagine a transcript of an hour would take at least a day, probably, to do. There are, though we haven't mentioned this, but there is also software that isn't always, it's not perfect, but there is software that you can get transcriptions either at quite an affordable price or for free. But I wouldn't be able to recommend any at the top of my head right now. Then in terms of the editing, then I would say that would take well, we often shared a bit of this work, Zoe, didn't we? Maybe about
Yeah.
probably a full day, both editing the text and then doing the editing yourself, maybe just over a day. So I think you're thinking of at least, I guess with this, we're probably thinking of at least probably 4 days of work, of full-time work, if not 5 days.
When we did the second episode, we were trying to concentrate on the experience of lockdown and COVID. So we had a greater sense of urgency to get episodes out between recording and broadcast, because they were more kind of current and of the moment. And it maybe took about a week between recording and broadcast, didn't it, in general? And that was being quite concentrated about it. But it depends on what your topics are. There might be less of a time pressure. You could record it and then it could take as long as you like before you broadcast it.
Yeah, so one thing that I think we did start doing was to try to do more batch recording. So then actually so that then you can then release things, as Zoe's saying, at the time that suits you.
Yeah.
So there's another question. So Sheila's asked about how long would you say research before starting? So yes, I was saying, I think the research plus the scripting took me about a day and a half. I think, again, this depends on what the subject is that you're researching. If it's something that's, some of you mentioned archives that you're working in. So I don't know if there would be actual more collections-based research or archive-based research that you might need to undertake. So this is relative, but I would say probably 2 days, or a day, between a day and 2 days. For a podcast is about 40 minutes.
So a good question here about, do we pay guests for their time? And the answer is we don't, because partly because paying people through the university's financial systems is hugely problematic. So we've tended to rely on asking academics who don't mind giving up their time to talk about their research, because that's what they're already paid to do. So the answer for you might be different, because you might want to pay people and your institution might have easier mechanisms for allowing you to pay them. So, in a sense, academics are already getting paid for their time, so we don't mind not paying them. Yeah. But I would agree that, I would agree that it's generally a good thing to pay people for their time. Yeah.
And just to say, I mean, that we are currently also having these kind of conversations in the museum about, well, because then do we have is it just academics that if we want to expand this, then we need to reconsider the model, because as Zoe says, we should be paying people for their time. There was a question about block recording, or do it as guests are available. I'm not sure exactly what you mean with block recording, Alice. I don't know if you want to clarify that.
Sorry, I think maybe I understand now. My question was sort of, do you sit in a room for a week and smash out all the background stuff, or do you just record every week for 6 weeks? But I guess it depends on your guests.
So I think during the period of lockdown, I was doing about 1 recording a week, but there was a week where I did 2 recordings. So I had to also adapt depending on the availability of guests. I think doing things online has actually made it easier in that respect, because you don't have to get people into the same room. But if you say you might be recording with someone who, like I did this with one episode with someone in Australia. So that if you have more than 1 guest who might be in different parts of the world, you might need to have those time considerations as well. There was 1 recording that I had to do at 8 p.m., for example. So there might be things that you might need to work around your guest. And I think it's good to establish a date as soon as possible. So then you know how that kind of structures, then you can plan around that and how you're going to, so you know the time it's going to take to do the work beforehand and afterwards. So once you have the dates, you can work around that. So I think the dates are good to get into the diary as soon as you can.
So a question here about costs for creating the series. So very roughly speaking, when we were paying someone to do the transcription and paying someone to do the sound recording, it was about £100-ish for each thing per episode. In other words, about £200 per episode. So that's a very rough ballpark figure. But as we've been saying, over and over, that depends on, you could spend a whole lot more than that. You could spend a lot less than that. And it somewhat depends on the resources you've already got. Because you might have someone, say you might have a volunteer who's very happy to transcribe the recording for you, then you may not have to pay them. But yeah, that's just a very sort of thumbnail ballpark figure. Episodes per season. I think in the first season we did 5. In the second we aimed to do 6, but then we did a bonus and made it 7. But I think 6 episodes per season is a good number, because then you've got enough there to be a kind of coherent look at a topic without giving yourself a whole load of work that you can't sustain. But again, that's a kind of dependent on who's involved and how many people and all of that.
And just to say, for us, other considerations we had there was the way the academic year works is at the university. So as I said earlier, I do a lot of teaching between early October till March. So we knew we couldn't really record because there isn't just time during that period. So then the recording would always happen. There would be a planning, say up to May, and then we record June, July, maybe into August, but that's always harder because people are not around. So maybe also thinking about when is the quietest time in your workplace, so that you're going to be able to do these batch recordings, or you can be more focused in doing that.
So in a way, it's like, what are the rhythms of your year, and when would this best fit in with your staff and your potential participants?
There's some useful links from Olivia there.
What has been our biggest learning during this experience?
Do you want to go, Zoe?
I think it's been, I don't know, what's our biggest learning? That's a very good question. I think it's been so interesting to see how different people approach the collections and talk, I suppose it's been just, I suppose there's been some technical knowledge about how to shape a podcast, and some more kind of conceptual knowledge about the sorts of conversations that we can have about the museum and its collections. I think that's what I would say about that, but it's a very good question. Do you want to say anything more about that, Anna?
I think for me, it was also helpful in terms of opening a new set of questions that we hope could lead to other projects in the future. I think it served actually like a thinking bubble. Like I think you can actually use the podcast in a way that you could maybe think a bit more left field, or just think outside the box, because you need to be thinking about how you're going to do this in an engaging way, but also how you might be connecting with people that you wouldn't usually connect with. So for me, it was just an interesting from a research perspective as well, looking at the collections from another angle.
It's made us think about the collections differently, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So people have to leave. Do you plan to keep the podcast going once the museum is reopened?
Yeah, I think so, because in a sense, as Anna was saying earlier, we don't have public galleries. We have people to visit us by appointment. So this is one of the ways in which we engage with our audiences. And in a sense, lockdown or no lockdown, this is still a really useful thing to do. Anything else?
There's a final question from Sheila. Do you think the podcast has changed a lot between season 1 and season 2 in terms of tone, confidence, time, etc.?
I think maybe we're not the best people to judge that.
I think
Go on.
No, I think it's a learning curve. I think yes. I guess yes and no. I think there's some constants that have remained, but I think in terms of having a sense of the overall picture of what it involves, I think then I felt much more confident in the process, I think, whereas I don't think I had the full I don't think I could see the full picture in the first season, because you were just kind of learning as you were going along. So I think it gives you some perspective, and I think that hopefully shows in the results, in the final result.
Okay, yeah. Any more final questions from anyone or comments?
It looks like that's all.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much, Zoe and Anna. I'm assuming I'm unmuted now.
Oh, I should have.
You are, yeah.
Brilliant.
Well,
Yeah.
thanks everyone for listening.